Well, for more, we can speak now to Mike Dubke, who is a former White House communications director who served under President Trump. Mike, great to have you with us once again here on Arabiya English. Some people are calling this chapter the biggest fraying of transatlantic ties in decades. Others are saying ever. Would you agree with that?
I don't think I would agree with that. I think we have a very short attention span lately, and whether that's due to social media or other things. I think the same thing was happening when during the first Trump administration, the president was requesting that NATO allies pay their fair share, that they meet their obligations to NATO. And I heard the same rhetoric at that time. So I don't buy into this, that this next iteration, this call for Greenland is going to shake the unity that we have here, but it does call into question how allies and how do friends deal with each other. And I think from that perspective, we've seen a lot play out over the last several months.
Right. I mean, do you call allies stupid? Do you call them irrelevant? These are some of the words that are being used by the Trump administration, not just from President Trump, but other people in his administration, directed at the UK, directed at France, directed at Denmark. I mean, what's behind that?
Well, so there's a difference between diplomatic language and the language of Donald J. Trump. And part of his appeal, at least to the American people, and frankly, I think when I travel the world, his appeal to others, is that he doesn't use the codified language and the carefully constructed sentences of diplomats and professional politicians. So while I am not one to use terms as stupid, the president has made a history of doing that, as well as ridden it to great success, at least electorally and in gathering support. So I think the leaders of Europe recognize that and take that in stride. And so again, I'm not as concerned about that language use or think that it's some stepping out of the norm that is going to cause a crisis.
Okay, and I mean, now that it sounds as though President Trump does not intend to use force to take Greenland. He said that earlier on today at Davos. What do you think's brought about that sort of about face? Because he wasn't entirely clear that he wouldn't use force before. In fact, his top aide, Stephen Miller, seemed to suggest that that was a perfectly reasonable course of action.
I think it's a couple of things. First of all, when you look at the negotiating tactics of Donald Trump, whether it be as a real estate developer or as president of the United States, part of his negotiating tactics has always been to go so far past where your adversaries think you will go. It brings them closer to your position just by them trying to reach an agreement like, you can't be serious, don't go that far. So one, I think this is to lay it out there, I think this is a very typical Trump negotiating tactic. Secondly, I think the meetings last week with the Danish foreign minister and with other European leaders and the phone calls that have been happening over the last week have really kind of brought this around, where you saw today in Davos, the president lay out for about 15 minutes of his speech a very clear, his very clear reasoning why he feels Greenland is so important. So I think you had a combination of typical Trump negotiating tactics, good conversations last week, and then this all coming to a fore for this very important speech in Switzerland today. Right.
You make some really good points there, Mike. You didn't mention opinion polls, and you did mention though earlier on President Trump's appeal to the broader public by using less typical language of a diplomatic figure or a head of state. So I'm wondering whether you think opinion polls played a part in his calculation. And I wonder whether you think perhaps some of the former generals, we've spoken to a few of them, former admirals, the top military brass in the United States, who sounded very uncomfortable with the suggestion even that force be used against Greenland. I'm wondering whether you think that might have played a part in President Trump's reevaluation of the idea of using force.
Well, as much as all politicians say they don't listen to opinion polls, all politicians do. And for better or worse, Donald Trump is a politician, a very accomplished one. He just approaches politics in a different way. So yes, I can imagine that the opinion polls, especially in the United States, where you show some level of support or understanding for his actions in Iran, for some support and understanding of his actions in Venezuela, there wasn't that same support and understanding of this rhetoric around Greenland. So one, I think opinion polls did play a part in this, absolutely. In terms of the generals and others who have spoken out about this, I think the main thing that has affected most politicians, generals, and the general public here is we're not talking about a country in Denmark or a piece of land in Greenland in which the United States does not already operate. We already have bases there. We have open agreements to have more military bases in Greenland. And so this seemed to be a lot to do about nothing, I think, for the American people. Now, obviously not to President Trump, but the same level of crisis, the same level of necessity just wasn't there. And I think that message is finally getting through to the administration when it comes to use of force. He's still very much interested, though, in making sure that Greenland and because of its strategic location, the defense of the Western Hemisphere against Russia and China is defended.
Right. I mean, President Trump's certainly had the effect of putting Greenland up the agenda quite considerably, and actually made it agenda item number one at pretty much every international forum in recent weeks. Then there's
amazing.
I mean, it's
really
that's an accomplishment in itself. I mean, no one would otherwise be talking about Greenland. But then we had a Danish MP on this show yesterday who said that the United States had actually done a drawdown on the number of troops it kept in Greenland. There were fewer today than there were in years past, raising some pretty important questions about the argument about Greenland's importance and its strategic importance. Why would you do a drawdown if having Greenland was so important and you actually wanted to put more troops there?
Yes, I think that's a very good point. We've also shrunk the number of bases that we've had in Greenland over the last several decades, but we've also done a drawdown. I also think it's a point of information that, in the larger context of the drawdown of American forces across the NATO countries, is important to remember. There's been a movement, a consolidation. Also, warfare is changing. Warfare is not just about boots on the ground anymore, as we're seeing in Ukraine and other places. It's the projection of force. And so Venezuela is a perfect example that we projected force as the United States off of Navy ships. In Iran, our projection of force was vis-a-vis airplanes that lifted off from the central part of the United States. So I think, that's a fair assessment by that Danish prime minister or minister of parliament, but I don't think it takes into account modern warfare, nor does it take into account the way that NATO has shifted its use of force over the last decade.
I mean, Mike, you've got a distinguished career in communications. I'd like to put this to you. The Danish MP we spoke to said Denmark would fight. Denmark would send troops and they would engage, and in all likelihood, soldiers on both sides would get killed. What would have been the optics of that scenario? How do you think that would have played out domestically and internationally, seeing American soldiers shooting and killing NATO soldiers over Greenland that most people in America don't have any interest in?
So I think optically and from a communication standpoint, it would have been a disaster. I mean, I do want to recognize that when America deployed troops to Afghanistan after the attack on the World Trade Centers, Denmark was with American forces in Afghanistan and deployed. When we instituted or asked for Article 5 of the NATO agreement to be invoked, Denmark was there. They lost, I believe, proportionally more soldiers in Afghanistan than any other NATO country. So I think the optics of it would have been terrible. And I think that's also part of the decision-making matrix that the president made in announcing today in Davos that the saber rattling that's been occurring over the last few weeks is just that. It's rattling. It's not intended action.
How's it played out in the media in the United States, Mike? I mean, is this the topic of conversation, or do you think the average American is thinking, do you know what? I don't really care that much about Greenland, and I'm more concerned about making ends meet with my paycheck in an environment where prices are high. Is that what people are more interested in, would you say?
It is. People are more conversational around a kitchen table, affordability, paying for groceries, paying for electricity. Interestingly, not gas, because gas prices are historically low in the United States right now, but electricity prices are up for heating people's homes as we're now in the winter season. Those are kitchen table items. When we're looking at the media, we're talking a lot about immigration and immigration enforcement in Minneapolis and other places in the United States. Greenland's part of the conversation, but it hasn't dominated the conversation. As I understand, it's dominated in Davos, that it is the start of almost every conversation at every cocktail party in that little Swiss town. So it's important, but it hasn't been all encompassing like it has been in maybe some European capitals and some other places around the world.
I mean, from the other side of the world, it does seem that US Congress has been extremely quiet on this issue. And, looking at public opinion, it's difficult to imagine that Congress would support any attempt to take Greenland by force, which we know now is not going to happen. It's also, startling that, Greenland to be made a part of the United States, there would have to be a treaty. That treaty would need a 2/3 majority in the Senate. And are there 67 senators who would join together and ratify such a treaty? What do you make of the reaction from the political class?
I think the math that you're laying out there is exactly right. It has been interesting, and I will point this out, that this debate around NATO and about Greenland actually has shown more cracks within the unity of the Republican Party in Congress than almost every other issue. We've had some members of the Senate go over to Copenhagen and say, look, we're standing with you against this rhetoric around Greenland. Those are Republicans as well as Democrats. We've had Republicans sign on to Democratic bills in the House of Representatives, saying that this is not something, we will not federally fund this. This is an area where Congress actually does have a voice, because for the United States to project this force, they need to pay for that force to be projected. And those purse strings are controlled by Congress. So beyond the 2/3 for a treaty that you bring up, I think even more immediately, there was growing interest in reining in the financial tools that the president, the administration would need to use for any military use of force in Greenland.
Okay, I mean, who's been particularly vocal? I mean, you say there are some splits in the ranks of the Republican Party.
Don Bacon in the House of Representatives comes to mind as a Republican, plus a large handful of Democrats. Lisa Murkowski in the Senate was just over in Denmark. She is very much, obviously, from being from Alaska, she's very much interested in Arctic policy. And, that is one thing that we do need to, focus on here. And I think the president has done a good job about this, that the northern defense of the Western Hemisphere and the northern defense of America against increased military activity by Russia and China is something that we haven't talked about in the United States over years. We kind of forget about the Arctic, but it is of growing importance, especially with shipping channels opening up north of Canada and the increased activity of our adversaries. The one benefit, I think, of this Greenland conversation that's come out is that the United States population is now more focused on Arctic policy and understanding Arctic defense. And that also plays into the Golden Dome, which is a whole other conversation we could get into.
Sure, and unfortunately this conversation is going to have to come to an end fairly shortly, but I did want to ask you, and I think we sort of know the answer to this question. Looking back to the Alps, to Davos specifically, there were those predicting a climb down, there were those predicting a showdown. What's it looking like to you?
I think it's interesting that the Greenland conversation, unlike most of the cocktail conversations in Davos, came late in his speech and wasn't at the top. I think the president, by laying out a blueprint for European growth, economic growth, I think the president stating that America is not retreating from the world. In fact, that it's even more engaged in the world. I think the fact that he talked about Ukraine before he talked about Greenland, all of these, and the fact that he gave a clear description of the interest in Greenland, and all of these factors, I think, I thought the speech was important from that aspect, because a lot of those questions, is America in retreat? Is America pulling back from its obligations? And I thought the president was very clear, no. We not only want to engage with Europe and the rest of the world, but we want to engage in a way in which we think we've figured out how to grow our economy, and for you to grow your economy as well without increasing inflation and without destroying and building a better economic future for your population and a better energy future for your population.
Okay, well, Mike Dubke, former White House Communications Director under President Trump, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us as ever.
Absolutely. Good to see you.